Hello and welcome to this week's What Were They Thinking? Among the news items we have for you, there are arguments that the decrease in COVID rates are not a relationship to vaccination rates. There is a range of very weird animal news to be had. Everything from creatures that don't need to breathe, through to giant snails eating houses. We have an interesting interview with an advocate for access, and free access at that, to journal articles and other research. There are weird radio waves coming from space, and a woman who got incredibly lucky. The timestamps for these and other news items can be found in the description box below. Let's start with one of the old arguments, especially from anti-vaxxers. That is, the reduction in any given disease has no relationship to vaccines being distributed to deal with said disease. The fact that the drop in rates was rather precipitous after vaccines became widely distributed is often put down to things like hygiene or something similar. It's never vaccines, despite vaccines being the common denominator. This is often supported by published research, and we use that term very loosely, that advocates for that line of reasoning. Vaccines don't do their job. Often this research is very poorly conducted, methodological flaws everywhere to be found, or very selective datasets being used. The article we link to in the description box below identifies some of these issues when they take apart the article, things like bias and cherry-picking of countries. This is notable in the lack of selection criteria. Any good research should tell you how they chose the people, the places, a given data set, anything like that. It may be something as fundamental as access to data. In other cases, it may be that they had a collaboration with a research center, and so they are able to work in their location and the collaborator's location. In other instances, it might be that they're looking at very specific geographical regions, or particular cultures, peoples, etc. But there should be some explanation. Further to this, there appears to be an imbalance in the number of countries that are low income or low development, and high income or high development. As we mentioned last week, the researchers that published one of the articles this week focused on Israel, and we mentioned how Israel is seeing drastically different results in mortality and hospitalization rates for serious COVID infections between those who are vaccinated and not vaccinated. The argument from the article that's being taken apart is that there's just a high number of cases. Well, yes. There will be a number of cases so long as you have nearly 1 million people who refuse to get vaccinated. In this instance, though, it doesn't account for those two other variables, mortality and hospitalizations with serious COVID. The next article we have is one of a larger series. In fact, there are at least 5 parts so far, and it's the most recent part in an address to the research into Ivermectin. Ivermectin being the horseworming medication that has been in part touted as a treatment for the CCP virus. The problem with this is that the research isn't that great. In fact, at least one of the major studies into this has been retracted because it was so incredibly questionable. Much like hydroxychloroquine was touted in the same way, there is very limited research indicating it might be useful, and meta-analyses are heavily biased by these fraudulent studies. And so you can see why there might be reason to look into the details. While we won't go into the details on the entirety of the 5-part series, we do want to point out that it's certainly worth a read as it goes through many of the issues associated with ivermectin and the research into it, and how, even if it's not misrepresented, it's certainly not enough to substantiate using it as a treatment. Going from published research of a questionable nature to published research, but questions about whether or not you should have to pay to access it. Recently, Sci-Hub celebrated its 10th anniversary. Sci-Hub, if you're not familiar, is a website designed to host research articles that would otherwise be held behind a paywall. This means that people can access it for free, and the Russian researcher who started it doesn't really care that the publishers are angry about it. Alexandra Albican started it in an attempt to make everything accessible. This was because they themselves, as a researcher, were struggling to access the necessary documentation and literature to be able to do their job as a researcher. They started it, and they were inevitably sued. This includes lawsuits in India, a $15 million award in America, and other rulings that, frankly, don't seem to have deterred the website at all. Alexandra Albican conducted an interview with Futurism, and it's certainly worth a read just to see why she did it and what they're doing it for. Going from interviews that are worth a read to a case study. This time, a case study of a man using natural oils to treat a sinus infection. Something that could have been addressed using regular nasal decongestants was instead treated with oils. Canada has some strange practices, although it's possible this may not be a Canadian issue. The 30-year-old Polish man, who had been studying in Canada for more or less the last 2 years, had to visit the emergency department with left side chest pain. The reason for this is that they had been gargling flaxseed oil and sesame oil nasal spray. Again, an interesting choice. The patient was not responding to regular use of antibiotics. As a result, they were scanned and they found evidence of extensive damage. This led to a biopsy, and the biopsy found what could be described as odd. A foreign substance surrounded by inflammation. There was also mucoid secretions from the right lung. This would appear not to be related to the CCP virus, which would be your first thought, perhaps infection. And this is where we can link back to a past news item that we've discussed, that being the e-cigarettes or inhalers, and the fact they were causing a mysterious respiratory disease. We may be seeing something somewhat similar. In that case, it was vitamin E oil that was getting into the lungs and causing the symptoms seen. It's thought that that may be the same thing that's happened here. The use of sesame oil as a nasal decongestant and the flax oil as a gargle may have led some of the oil getting into his lungs. That would then have led to the body trying to remove the foreign material in the form of oil, and in doing so causing inflammation. Another medical development, although this time not necessarily a case study, is the use of a interesting and novel method to be able to get drugs into the brain. One of the big problems with the brain as far as treatments go is the blood-brain barrier. This is a very effective means of filtering out just about everything. In order for drugs, especially chemotherapy drugs for cancer, to be able to get into the brain, you either need to put in a lot of it, which can often have very untoward side effects, or you need to find a way to get it into the brain. That involves getting it through the blood-brain barrier. That's where a new medication has allowed for the movement of drugs from the blood through the blood-brain barrier and into sites where tumours were located. This significantly shrunk the tumour, although admittedly this is very early stage research. Going now to a range of weird animal news. We'll start with something between China and Britain. China has banned the import of British beef. This is because not that long ago there was an instance of mad cow disease being detected. mad cow disease is a prion disease, and it's spread by a protein that's malformed. Unfortunately, it causes other proteins that it comes in contact to also malform and more or less propagate it. This can go from cows to humans. It can also be caught by humans directly when they consume other humans. It in fact was first identified in the UK as a product of the meat industry feeding meat waste products back to animals. The reason this particular event is so important is that it took nearly 28 years for China to be willing to allow imports of British beef after the last time there was a large-scale outbreak of mad cow disease. This is just one instance on one farm, and yet they've ceased all imports. Going from weird animal news about cows to weird animal news about roundworms, specifically nematodes in this case. These are flatworms, so incredibly tiny creatures, often living in the soil, although occasionally becoming parasitic. The specific one we want to talk about here are the Caenorhabditis elegans. They are ones that lay eggs, and then after they've laid their eggs, they begin to provide nutrition directly to their offspring. This by itself is weird. Often egg-laying creatures don't provide milk, except for monotremes, which are Mother Nature's weird black sheep of a child. What else is weird here is not only that they lay the eggs, but they can self-fertilize. This means that they're hermaphrodites. They have both male and female sex organs. They'll fertilize the eggs themselves, lay the eggs, and then feed them. It gets even weirder though, as most of the time when you look at nematodes at will. The way they feed them or produce milk is by beginning to break down their own organs and secrete them out. This has benefits for the young, who grow much larger much more quickly as a consequence. Going from one soil-based creature to another, this time giant snails. Giant snails that in Florida were eating homes. That might sound like the plot to a B horror movie, but no. The very large snail can begin destroying properties. This is the African land snail. The African land snail grows to about 20 centimeters, or for those of you who insist on imperial numbers, 8 inches. They need a lot of calcium. This helps them in developing their shell, along with keeping everything else going. When they can't get that from the environment, well, they start breaking down things like mortar and stucco on houses. This is a problem for homeowners. In order to mitigate the not insignificant damage they'll do, Florida has spent the last 10 years working at getting rid of them. This was not a cheap or easy process, and in fact, it cost more than $24 million. $24 million to get rid of giant snails. Over the 10 years, more than 168,000 snails were caught, and this is not an easy feat. Not only do they come out at night, but they like to hide, and they tend to like to come out when it's raining. When it's not raining, or during the day, they bury themselves about 20 centimeters below the soil line. Another weird creature, this time rather than a mollusk, it's going to be something that doesn't need to breathe. Tadpoles are an odd creature. Normally they need to breathe at least somewhat. Admittedly, they have to breathe less because of their small size, but like their adult form of a frog, they do need to breathe. By modifying the tadpoles with the introduction of photosynthetic algae into them, they could create a symbiotic relationship between the two species. This meant that the tadpole required no environmental oxygen to be able to keep on living. Everything could be done via photosynthesis. As a concept, this isn't actually that weird. Algae are actually responsible for most oxygen production on Earth. which may surprise you if you think it's because of trees. Rather, trees are better at sequestering carbon, but algae is better at producing oxygen. If you can then introduce the algae into an organism, and it can photosynthesize appropriately, it can then produce oxygen and keep that organism alive. It's the combination of the two, the symbiosis, that's often so hard to get right. In less weird but somewhat disappointing news, it's taken 2 years for an elk to finally be freed from having a car tyre that's been around its neck. 2 years to be able to tranquilize the bull elk and be able to remove the tyre. Admittedly, it's not going to be an easy feat no matter how you look at it. It's a 4.5-year-old elk. It weighs 600 pounds, and when it was first identified, probably wouldn't have weighed much less. In order to be able to remove the tyre that was full of various dirt and debris, they had to remove the horns from the animal, as the tyre was simply too hard to take off, which, considering that the elk's been wandering around for 2 years around its neck, would be a fair indication that it's a hard thing to get rid of. What is fortunate is that the elk was more or less unharmed by its weird experience. There was some fur removed and a minor wound, but nothing particularly notable and nothing that would see the animal harmed overall. It's simply the disappointing observation and no doubt unpleasant experience for the elk of having a large tyre around its neck full of rubbish that would have been weighing it down. The next news is something of a cross between animals and robotics. The military robo-dog armed with a sniper rifle. Yeah, this again sounds like the plot to a B-rated movie, but no, this is an actual real thing. The robo-dog itself is not that new. That's been in development for a long time with various companies. It's the arming it with weapons that's got people on edge. The idea fundamentally is that you can send the dog out with a squad of soldiers where it is able to carry a very large weapon, use it very effectively, and function continuously. This would help to mitigate risk to soldiers and various other issues with people. The controversy comes from the idea of not only getting robots to kill people, but turning them into a canine shape. Is it okay to create a robot, and a robot at that in the shape of a dog, that will go out and kill, especially without the degree of control that most autonomous killing systems have now? Weapons platforms like the unmanned aerial vehicles or drones that have been dropping bombs and missiles on various parts of Afghanistan for the last 10 years. At the same time, this particular platform, or at least the idea, is not new either. You have the assassination of an Iranian scientist by Israeli operatives in November of last year, and you have the current platforms used for disposal of bombs and the robots mounted with weapons to clear buildings. This means that it's not so much a new development so much as it is to say that it's a development that we don't like. And this is where those early on ethical concerns we mentioned come into play. Going from weirdness on Earth to weirdness in space. Are we actually seeing messages from aliens? Is something sending us a radio wave from another planet? The radio signals seem to turn on and off at random, and they're coming from the center of the galaxy. This means that there's clearly something happening here. It could be that there's an object moving in between the signal and blocking it, or it could be that something is being turned on and off at a long distance away. Astronomers have been able to rule out a range of possible sources, primarily stars. What they have been able to identify so far is that it appears to be a very small object and it changes very quickly, but there are very wide periods where it's otherwise inactive. And no doubt we won't solve this mystery for quite some time yet. The final news item, and not so much a mystery as sheer luck, A woman almost died when a meteorite crashed through her ceiling and landed on her bed. We are curious as to what this British Columbia woman did that was enough to piss off something powerful enough to send a meteor directly towards her. She woke up purely by luck, moving enough to dodge the meteorite because her dog was barking. So, as said, survival, not so much by any particular action or anything on her part, but sheer luck. That's all the news we have for you this week. Thank you for watching. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please post any comments, questions, or suggestions that you have below.